Colombia has had multiple peace processes and accords since 1981, including with the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or the FARC, the April 19th Movement, or M19, and the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, or AUCE, and they're starting a peace process, or its next instantiation, with the National Liberation Army, or ELN. Practitioners in Colombia possess unique insights on peace processes, and specifically on the military's role in peace talks and facilitating disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration. And I might add personally, from the multiple countries with which I've worked in terms of reintegration, Colombia truly has one of the most remarkable programs to support these processes. If wars between states are politics by other means, then internal irregular conflicts are violent political rhetoric. Winning in the battlefield is not sufficient to bring the conflicts to an end. Defense and military policymakers and practitioners must understand not just how to fight these wars, but the politics of how to conclude them. Understanding Colombia's experience is a great place to start. Today we have with us two distinguished experts who will shed light on the role of Colombia's military in the peace process between the government of Colombia and the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, their subsequent role during the demobilization and disarmament of the FARC, and the challenges that uneven implementation of the peace accords has created for security and stability in Colombia. Before we begin, I'd like to set the stage by highlighting the landscape that we find ourselves in. Briefly, in 2012, peace talks began between the FARC and the government of Colombia. I had the privilege of conducting fieldwork in Colombia between 2010 and 2018. During the talks in 2014 and 2016, I spent about 15 months living in an informal housing settlement with about 3,000 families of former FARC members and 3,000 families who were largely somehow victims of the armed conflict. And I might also add that many of these individuals straddled both of these identities. In 2016, the peace accord was signed after a referendum that gave a bit of pause to the process. But in November of 2016, the peace accord was signed. And I must say, at the time, working with the International Organization for Migration on implementing the reintegration component of the peace accord, there was a great deal of hope for what might be possible for the future of Colombia. However, the implementation of the accord has faced many challenges alongside a few notable successes, and those challenges are what we're here to discuss today. Our first panelist, Omar Cortez, is the Associate Director for the Andean Region for Control Risks Office in Bogota, providing security consulting, operational risk management, and transformation advice for projects in Colombia and the Andean region. Omar is a retired captain of the Colombian Navy with extensive experience in leading strategic and operational processes related to intelligence, maritime protection, security sector reform, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration processes, or DDR, and mediation. Highlights of Omar's recent experience include conducting investigations of narco-traffic contamination incidents in ports in Colombia, Panama, and Peru, supporting the transition for security departments for mining operations in Colombia and Ecuador, reviewing facilities of industrial facilities in Chile, and assessing risks for agricultural oil and gas and renewables operations in Colombia and Venezuela. Prior to his work with control risks, Omar provided security consulting and advisory for the United Nations Verification Mission in Colombia. Perhaps we crossed paths at one point. And expertise support for the Folke Bernadotte Academy in Sweden. Omar served as a member of the negotiation team for the end of conflict partial agreement as part of the peace talks in Havana between the Colombian government and the FARC, and later was a military observer for the tripartite verification mechanism for the ceasefire and FARC's disarmament. Juan Vargas, to his right, is professor of economics at Universidad de Rosario, Colombia, where he was named Distinguished Professor in 2014. He is also the network director of the America Latina Crime and Policy Network of the Latin America and Caribbean Economics Association. and a board member of Evidence in Governance and Politics at LACEA. He holds a PhD in economics from Royal Holloway, University of London, and has held visiting academic positions at Harvard, NYU, and UCLA. His main interests lie in the areas of political economy and development, focusing particularly on the causes and consequences of violent armed conflict, the economics of crime and their interplay between political and economic, formal and informal institutions in the process of state building. In 2018, Juan obtained the biennial Juan Luis Loloño Prize, awarded to the best Colombian economist under 40. We are excited to have these two experts join us today for an insightful discussion. Today's discussion will be divided into three segments. First, our panelists will provide their opening remarks, outlining their perspectives on the government's peace process with the FARC-EP, the implementation of the accords, and the implications for security and stability. Next, we will move to a moderated discussion where our panelists will delve into some examples of the military's role in the peace process and assess the effectiveness of policy responses and explore potential strategies to apply lesson learned to strengthen the peace process with the National Liberation Army and support President Petro's plans for paz total, or total peace. Finally, we will open the floor to questions from our distinguished audience, allowing for a broader and more interactive dialogue. As we embark on this intellectual journey, we hope to foster a better understanding of the complexities and nuances of the peace process with the FARC and peace accord implementation, and to identify potential recommendations for mitigating their negative impacts on stability and prosperity. To begin, we'll start with Omar, who will address the military's role in the peace negotiations with the FARC in Havana, and later in the tripartite monitoring and verification mechanism composed of the Colombian government, FARC, and UN observers. Then we will transition to Juan, who will address how the implementation or lack of implementation of the peace accords has affected local economic development in some of the most afflicted areas of the country and what implications that may have on policies and politics. With this context in mind, let us now turn to our panelists for their insights and perspectives. Thank you.
Thank you, Erin. And thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you especially to the Irregular Warfare Initiative, Universidad del Rosario, that I probably have my two kids that are studying in this university. And Erin, the moderator, Juan, thank you so much. And especially to Ogi Dominguez, that is not with us, but I have the honor to be my friend and also to invite me to this special event. So I want to highlight first to all that the DDR processes in Colombia, there is no new for us. We have a different processes that we faced in the past with between 1984 and 2023 with another armed groups that at the end of the process, the end of this process was with the destroy of the weapons. So, for example, with the M19, EPL, Quintin Lame, the self-defense paramilitary groups, and as you know, also with the ELN, we are now developing negotiations in Havana. But I want to highlight because Colombia gained a lot of experience about how to negotiate with these kind of groups, but also to develop public policy to support the demobilization and reincorporation process for ex-combatants. Even introducing security sector reform alternatives, for example, to integrate ex-combatants within the National Protection Unit or the former DAS, that was the one of the agencies in intelligence that, especially to some tasks to protect another combatants into the reincorporation processes. So I want to highlight also some key factors. And I'm sorry because I didn't see it so far, but I want to highlight that there were four main factors that promote our participation, the military participation within the negotiations with FARC. The first was the adaptability, and I'm sorry, but before to say that, if you can see, is kind of a logical steps, because between 2002 and 2006, we have the government by the President Uribe. He released his security policy to regain the control in the territories by strength, the military, the intelligence, the special forces. But somehow, between 2006 and 2008, we observed that the FARC, especially the FARC, adapt to the military strategy. So was at that moment, for example, in 2007, we have a lot, I mean, all the resources. We have a really good intelligence. We have the US support. We have a really trained people, the biggest strikes, but the FARC adapted. So at that moment, we start to understand that maybe it's not about the solution just by the weapons. So that's why we start to understand that that was the political exit, maybe was the more successful. So we based our studies also in another studies. For example, there was a really good document by the RAND Corporation that was entitled How Terrorist Groups End. And this is from Johnson Levicki in 2008, more or less. And that it was really helpful for us because, yeah, there is another options to end this kind of terrorist groups. And definitely, even in their study, release some parameters for each group of the different kind of groups. And definitely the FARC, with a political program, was in this that we can catalogate that was one of these kind of groups that can end by the political way. So yeah, at that moment we start to think more about how to solve this problem. So in 2009, well, there was a really good exercise that was the strategic leap, el salto estratégico. The strategic leap was mainly was an academical program research integrated by the military with civil institutions. Yeah, to understand what is the problem with the narco traffic, what is the problem with the terrorism, what is the problem with the illegal mining, with the other factors, and definitely with by the weakness for the civil institutions. So at that moment, a small group of military started to think we need to prepare for the next phase and a negotiation, a political negotiation. So between 2011 and 2012, we received some signals from FARC. And with those signals, the government, led by the High Commission Office, start these secret exploration meetings in Venezuela, in the border between Colombia and Venezuela, to understand the will by the FARC and and even to get some information if they have the real will to go to promote a negotiation. So that's one of the four key factors. But when the negotiation started in October 2012, with the release, the public announcement in the public table in Oslo, we already started military preparations to support the peace negotiation. It started with intelligence. It started to give some resources to the negotiators by the government about who are the negotiators by FARC. But after that, the president, Santos, at that moment, says, okay, this is really helpful because these guys knew more and can give us more support. The Minister of Defense at that moment, Juan Carlos Pinzón, former ambassador in the United States, he built an advisory board. I was part of that advisory board. I was the official rapporteur. So yes, I have the memories, but I didn't write at the moment, just a couple articles. But at that moment, we start to think, first of all, to understand the real will by the FARC leaders. Also, to understand the will by the structures in the territories, but also to approach as a team, as a military team, with alternatives for the disarmament, the mobilization, and the reincorporation of combatants. So that's why we also developed an infrastructure by the military and the national police to support the negotiation. So was military groups within the hierarchical military pyramid, but also with people from Army, Navy, Air Force, National Police, thinking all the time about different alternatives and even some about different guidelines. For example, the DDR, the disarmament, how to destroy the weapons, but also transitional justice for the military. So that was a really helpful apparatus to support all participation. So we are talking about that we, before we get or we put our first step in Havana to negotiate, we have more or less years and a half studying, researching, discussing. Even we have regular weekly meetings in the highest level with the Vice Minister of Defense, some journals, intelligence, some clever people involved to think about our participation, but also the next steps by the military in the peace process. So finally, we get to the Havana. The parties, they released the mandate for the technical subcommittee for the ending of the conflict. Focus in build a model of ceasefire, cease of hostilities, and disarmament. So we start to work on 1st of March of 2015. If you can see in the picture, there are the military, the first line are the generals, the main negotiators, the plenipotenciarios, and in the last line, the people that real work. Sorry. But yeah, we're in formal tie. Yeah, no, it was a kind of show our presence right there. But this is one of the most paradoxical encounters that we have with the FARC, because yeah, we are mainly with intelligence background. We understand the combatants, but was the first time that we officially salute them. So my first touch was with Joaquin Gomez. Joaquin Gomez was the leader of the one of the main blocks in the Caribbean. Tough guy. I investigate them a lot, yeah. But the thing that the first salute was with respect. Captain, nice to meet you. I'm Joaquin Gomez. Joaquin, nice to meet you. Captain Omar Cortez. So they always refer with us with our grade. But after that, we really fast understand that they respect us because our experience in the battlefield, was kind of, it's a dialogue between similars, both military, both on the ground, both with a lot of heart between each other. And yeah, was a reconnaissance between parties. It was really helpful for us and all the dynamic. So we start to build a model of DDR. Part of our experience, for example, was to visit and also to understand different DDR processes. I have the opportunity to get information about the Myanmar process that was currently at the moment the experience by in Central America, Guatemala, Salvador, also in Central Africa, in Asia. Yeah, they give us a lot of lessons for us. They give us a lot of information, lesson learned, best practices. Yes, yeah, but these guys has more experience in negotiation than us. These guys, for example, being in a more or less 3 more negotiations with the Colombian government. For us, was the first. So one of the challenges was we have the technical knowledge, but these guys has the skills. So it was a challenge for us. But the dynamics between the military, and it was a really important for us to remember that Manuel Marulanda, Tiro Fijo, that was the main leader from FARC, he says, when Colombian military was involved in negotiations, the confrontation between the government and the FARC will be ended. And it was really fresh for all of them and for us. Yeah. So, as I mentioned, we trust building based in respect. The both parties' knowledge of the terrain, military experience, and contact with the population affected by the conflict was really helpful. The dialogue in La Habana, maintaining military actions in Colombia. You have to keep in mind that we are negotiating in Havana, but we are fighting in Colombia. And we have different strikes. I can remember, for example, April 4, 2015. Yeah, 1 month after our formal beginning, we received a strike. They killed 12 soldiers in Cauca. And the next day, we've been in Havana. So, yeah, we went to that day in the Palco room in Havana. It was really tough for us because we felt, the loss of our soldiers. There is no word about this. Was just a little mention that we need. That's the kind of thing that we need to end, and we start to work, and we continue to work. So after that, the Colombian military killed in action 2 leaders from FARC was really hurtful for them. But this kind of the issues that but definitely that reinforce also our will to negotiate.
And and definitely, yeah, one of the one of the opportunities that we have is that as a subcommittee, focus in the ceasefire and the disarmament was that keep it technical all the time. If there is any political discussion, no, this is not here. It's for the upper level, the highest level with the plenipotentiarios and the main delegates from FARC. Is not here. So was really helpful even to move on in the model. So this is the military delegates and the peace process in Havana. Just one woman. She's working right now. She's the captain, lieutenant captain from the Colombian Navy. She's retired right now. She's working with the UN, with the DPPA department. In the first line are the generals, admiral, and a colonel, captain. One of the real products that gives support for the whole ceasefire and the disarmament was the creation of the three-party monitoring and verification mechanisms. Was composed by FARC delegates, Colombian military. I was part of that team, and also by the UN verification mission as the international component. So this was one of the as a result of the negotiation, of course, but also I think the most useful tool to give the support and the structure for the whole process, starting even from the design and the size of the different areas where the combatants were located, but also how to develop the different routes and movements from the field for those areas, and how to build the different areas. But one of the most helpful things also how to train the members of the three-party mechanism, because was tripartism. So we need to mostly to give the skills by equal for FARC, military, and international component UN. As a result of this process, where we had more or less 15,000 of weapons destroyed, with the final destination of monuments. The people in the reincorporation process that is still in the reincorporation, and was the beginning of the whole process of reincorporation. So why was this three-party mechanism innovative and successful? And we have 5 lessons about this. Okay, it's not on time. Okay, because the tripartites offer the parties and society also a double guarantee. An impartial verification by the international component represented by the UN delegates that are composed by mainly military observers from the habla hispana, and also to give the direct monitoring by the government and FARC. And this direct monitoring by government and FARC in 3 levels: the local, the regional, and the national level, give also transparency, thanks to the permanent information to to communicate with the population and the different institutions involved in the local processes. But also because the joint verification allows the parties to resolve disagreements quickly and serves as a trust building factor. That was really helpful. One of the things that you work as a team is that you confront the problems as a team. And so you, in a complementary way, the military, the FARC guys, and the UN try to solve a problem. So yeah, there was incidents. There was this, but in comparative way with another process around the world was the less with incidents and violations to the ceasefire and the disarmament. And also because the integration of the international expertise with the parties and knowledge on the ground allows challenges to be overcome and threats contained. And definitely, one of the ground rules is not to impose, but to build. And what's one of the key factors also to develop this process. Finally, this is, as you mentioned, the referendum that was really controversial because the referendum was in the first weekend of October 2016. The previous signing of the agreement was in September in Cartagena, a really big show with the parties signing the agreement, touchful. But after that, there was the referendum that was negative. For a small margin, but I mean, was negative. So at that moment, we say, okay, so we need to fight right now each other again? And we say no. We went to the Havana and we signed an agreement and protocol to continue with the ceasefire and the cease of hostilities. So it was a really good show of our will, common will between FARC and us to continue with the process of the ceasefire. So, lastly, I want to highlight 4 things that as a Colombian retired military, as a lessons for you, I hope. I think that the first is that the active participation by the armed forces offer trust, but also structure, political will, definitely, and support for the stabilization within the territories. Definitely, our experience in the field, as maybe you can understand, the Colombian military is the only institution that remains in the field all the time. The second one is that, but this support is not enough, because it's military, it's national police, it's public force, and it's the monopoly of the use and the use of weapons to maintain the order. But this is not enough because without the local institutional strength, the challenge to strengthen the local capacity and to change the roots that originate the conflict still remain. The Colombian armed forces have shown their capability to perform in the battlefield, but also in the peace negotiations and the implementation. One of the things that we miss is that the three-party mechanism doesn't continue. There was another figures, especially led by the UN verification mission, but the tripartite ends with the disarmament. And maybe if you maintain this kind of apparatus to maintain the dialogue, it's really helpful for the reincorporation. That is the real challenge. From my perspective, the disarmament is the easy thing. It's technical. This has a start, it has an end. Okay? You involve technical people, but the real challenge is reincorporation into society for these combatants. And lastly, I think that this was so successful because the military showed their commitment and their professionalism and the real will to move on. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Omar, for that excellent presentation. And there were so many incredible insights there, but in particular, I appreciated your comments about the importance of trust building. And I'm fascinated by the divorcing of the negotiations from the political discourses that were happening. And I maybe hope we have some time to discuss that later. Among many other points. Thank you. Juan, I would like to now turn to you, please, to discuss the impacts of the uneven implementation of the accord. So once that part was done, many challenges followed, and particularly in the programs having to do with land reform. So economic and social development of the rural areas and the provision of land to poor farmers and illegal drugs trade. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Thank you so much, Erin. Delighted to be here. Thank you for organizing this panel to the Regular Warfare Initiative and for inviting me to be here. And so first off, a couple of things. The issue of land restitution and land reform, we have discussed that in this conference at length. So we had the fortune of having a paper by Christopher Blair from Princeton with co-authors from Harvard and Chicago that is designing an evaluation precisely of that. And it seems that we'll be able to learn soon what are the effects of that land restitution policy. So look forward to that. I'm probably not going to talk much about that since we haven't seen sort of hard evidence of the results of that. It seems, though, that they are promising. The other thing is that I thought that the reason that Omar couldn't see his slides up on the screen was because he's older than me, but no, I can neither. But the worst thing is that I don't have them in my phone, so I have to improvise. So what I'm going to be doing in the next few minutes is something that is a little bit challenging. So first of all, I'm not going to present a lot of pictures. So that's going to be much more boring than Omar's presentation. And second of all, what I'm going to try to do is to try to summarize some of my research on sort of what are the effects of Colombia's peace agreement with FARC, highlighting that there are both positive consequences and negative consequences, probably negative unintended consequences, and trying to get at what I think are the key sort of structural factors why the peace agreement has produced also negative consequences in addition to positive consequences related to some of the issues that were discussed previously by Erin and then by Omar. And just to preempt myself, let me just tell you that I think there are a few issues that are important here. One that is very important is that the peace process and the peace agreement was not concomitant to efforts from the government to sort of build to bring the state to the municipalities in which FARC was present, and to build state institutions and to bring state capacity to those areas. So to some extent, when FARC sort of demobilized and ceased to be a violent actor, those areas became kind of vacant. So if you couple that with another key factor, which is that the peace agreement or the peace negotiation was by definition or by the way it was conceived was only one of many actors, then this vacuum of power that I just described creates the chances for other armed groups, illegal actors to sort of try to dispute these areas, and that is partly what sort of explains these negative results in some barrels. So I'm trying to do that. So first of all, let me just show sort of the timeline that we have in mind. Of course, this is based on sort of objective information that we have, but I'm going to try to highlight sort of key variation that we have here. First, the peace negotiation started, as has been said in this panel, in October 2012, during the first presidency of Santos, and then Santos was so he was reelected, and they ended at the end of 2016 with the events that have been described. First, the signature of the peace agreement, and then a referendum that, first of all, was not necessary, but Santos's hubris insisted him that he needed to do that, and then it got rejected. And that's important because that's also going to explain part of the sort of temporal variation that we see in some of the outcomes, because that created first lots of uncertainty, the sort of diminished the legitimacy of the peace agreement to an extent, and also that opened the door for sort of the political opposition of the peace agreement, the political losers of the agreement, to empower them politically, and ultimately that party got elected under the sort of promise that they were going to tear apart the peace agreement, and thankfully they didn't, but they did halt the implementation of the peace agreement a lot. So something that I want to emphasize from this timeline is the fact that there is this ceasefire, a permanent ceasefire that was declared by FARC in the 20th of December 2014, and that ceasefire was largely met. It's important. Let me just briefly tell you what I think FARC declared this permanent ceasefire. So it was kind of unexpected for the following reason. So there are ceasefires usually in December in Colombia by the larger armed organizations, and it's because it's Christmas time, and what they do is that they commit for a ceasefire around Christmas and New Year's, and that's it. Okay, so people were expecting FARC to do that, and what they say is that, okay, this is a permanent ceasefire. And they did that for two reasons. First, to show that they have a unified command. So essentially, it was put in question both nationally by the media, as academics, but also in the negotiation table. It was put in question the extent to which the government's negotiating team was negotiating with an organization capable of sort of representing the entire set of fronts, heterogeneous set of fronts that FARC had across the territory. So they showed unified command. And second, they showed their commitment, as Omar said, their commitment to reach a peace agreement. So there was this ceasefire that was largely met, and then they came the implementation or lack of implementation period starting at the beginning of 2017. So there's a lot to see in this timeline that I tried to summarize. And essentially, I don't know what it's written there. So this is the problem of being sort of an academic, and especially an economist. So Mariana, we use slides all the time, and especially economists. That is that we know what we're talking about. We have our slides and we read them. So here, what I want to emphasize is probably two things that, to some extent, the events that I have described for us academics, especially economists, they create variation. They create variation, temporal variation, and also sort of variation in the cross-section that allows us to evaluate things with quasi-experimental methodologies, especially. So what I do with my co-authors in this setting is that, okay, so the ceasefire was sort of unexpected and largely met. That created this sort of vacuum of power, and that vacuum of power is going to be exploited by other armed groups. So this is a lot of sort of temporal cross-sectional variation that we exploit empirically. And I'm not going to talk about methods in this panel. So I have a presentation actually in this afternoon. Sorry that you had to see my face twice today, but that presentation, of course, is going to highlight this sort of methodological part. But I just want to tell you sort of the intuition of what we do to evaluate these things. So we're going to exploit this sort of temporal variation given by the ceasefire and this cross-sectional variation given by the fact that some of the areas that were previously either controlled by FARC or areas that were that had violence by FARC, so not necessarily the same areas for the reasons we know. And there are many political scientists in this room that are happy to enter in that debate. But so I'm just highlighting that these are not the same areas. So violence affected areas or areas controlled by FARC. And so the ceasefire is definitely going to affect especially those areas. And that's going to create a variation that we can use to evaluate things. So some of the papers that we have written exploiting this variation to try to understand in a more substantive way what are the consequences of the peace process and agreement with FARC is first, we highlight that, okay, so there are this creates new economic opportunities in areas that were used to have FARC's presence, and the reason is essentially that FARC exerts governance. So we know about rebelocracy and Arjona exerts governance, and to some extent is also, for instance, an environmental regulatory agency to the extent that it doesn't allow businesses to enter, or it charges a vacuna or a tax, and to some extent, some of the businesses cannot enter these areas, and it has been said that some FARC fronts actually they didn't want, because of the relationship with the peasants, they didn't want many of these businesses to enter because they would just accumulate land and exploit that land. So the first thing that we see is that there's been a huge explosion in deforestation in the areas that used to be controlled by FARC after the start of the ceasefire. We're motivated. By the way, this is a paper with Santiago Savera, who was here yesterday, commenting on Sandra's paper and Munu Prem. So there were these sort of headlines in papers. So Colombia se fue las FARC y aparece la deforestación. So FARC is gone and now we have deforestation. So we wanted to test whether this was right. So this is sort of what we call the raw data, and these are deforestation patterns in areas with and without FARC presence over a long period of time. And we see that you see the ceasefire is a vertical line there, and probably with some lag that has to do probably not necessarily with the ceasefire, but just the cease agreement itself. There is differential and very large increase in deforestation. There is an increase in deforestation in the entire country. That's important. And this because the country became much more peaceful and much more friendly to do new businesses. If you look at the evolution of foreign direct investment, it follows a pattern like that. But what's important is that deforestation increased disproportionately more in FARC-affected areas. This is what we see in that graph, and the following graph is exactly the same, but in the way we like to present it as this is the sort of the dynamic diff in diff. So this is the differential, the evolution of differential deforestation in FARC affected areas vis-a-vis other areas of the country, and this was like a 12% increase in deforestation on average after this ceasefire. And the other thing that is important is that, of course, you could see that this is not necessarily bad, right? So this is economic activity, and economic activity is so we care about environmental conservation, but we also care about sort of economic activity. So why would this be why am I placing this in the bad or unintended consequences? And the reason is the following, which is, I think, interesting. The interesting part of this paper probably is the fact that because we have data on deforestation at the pixel level, which these are 30 meters per 30 meters, we can actually see whether the new deforestation patches that happen after the start of the ceasefire are sort of very small. And if they are very small, they are consistent with the returning of peasants to former to the land that was dispossessed, or they were displaced, or whatever. So these are peasants sort of reworking their land, and these would produce small patches of deforestation, and I guess that's okay from a perspective of having displaced people returning and all that. Alternatively, you could have like big agro industries coming to these municipalities and tearing apart the forest to sort of put forward their businesses. And we find that is the latter. So we find that we have very big patches of deforestation in these areas, not consistent with smallholding agriculture. But also what's important is that these are even bigger and more prevalent in areas with less state monitoring capacity. So to some extent, deforestation is sort of going wild in these areas, and that's sort of the first result. The second negative result is that the killing of local social leaders has sort of also surged in areas that used to be controlled by FARC, and this just to highlight two things that I've already said. This is for two reasons. First, the peace agreement or the peace process actually didn't entail other non-state actors that are also powerful and have a lot of de facto power in Colombia. And the second, but that's the nature of the beast. What can we do? Paz total is a different animal to deal with. And the second is precisely the fact that this is much more policy. This is a policy instrument that is very straightforward, of course, difficult administratively and economically, but it's something that is necessary in Colombia, that the government didn't actually move into these areas to occupy these areas, not only militarily, but also with its institutional supply, right? So that actually create a vacuum of power, and that the vulnerability of these municipalities to other armed groups that were in the vicinity of these municipalities, it increases violence, and especially targeted towards local leaders, because are the people who are represent the community in this process. So this is the timeline that I had shown you before, but if you look at the evolution of killings of local social leaders, Colombia is a violent country, 50 years of conflict, so this is not like they were never killed before, but the rate of killings of social leaders sort of skyrockets after the start of the ceasefire, precisely, not before nor after. It's what we have in this picture, and so it has to do with FARC's inability to respond violently to sort of challenges of the territory because of the ceasefire. But not only with that, but it also has to do with the vulnerability of specific places to other armed groups. So here we measure that vulnerability with sort of whether those FARC-affected areas were in proximity to areas controlled by other armed groups, including ELN and bandas criminales, and you can see that the increase in the killing of leaders is in the interaction of former FARC areas and areas controlled by exposed to other armed groups. And I have to say that this paper, probably I said this paper is published in the QJPS and is co-authored with a bunch of people, including Andres Rivera, who's sitting right here. So Andres, thank you for participating in this. We also examine what type of leaders are being killed, and these are especially like community leaders, so leaders from juntas de acción comunal, which are precisely the type of leaders that represent the community in their relationship with the government, and also leaders that work in conflict in victims from conflict organizations. But there are also good news, and here I just want to highlight two of the papers that show that there are good news. One that is very important for the future of Colombia, for the social and economic future of Colombia, is that we also find that there's a huge increase in a bunch of educational and learning outcomes of children of all ages in former FARC-affected municipalities, right? So exploiting sort of the same variation, the ceasefire, and the variation in terms of exposure to violence of FARC, we find that there is a huge increase in these type of outcomes. And the motivation of this is essentially that we know a lot about the effects of conflict on human capital. So conflict sort of hinders the accumulation of human capital and affects specifically children and all that, but we know very much less about the end of the conflict. And you know, it's not necessarily that we're going to end up with the flip side, because essentially conflict termination has many institutional features and security features that prevent for this to happen necessarily. What we find in the case of Colombia, in a paper with Munu and Olga Namen that is published in the Journal of Human Resources, is that there's indeed a huge, improvement in education. So the first panel out there shows that there's a decrease in dropout rates, and then you see that there's an increase in repetition rates, and there's an increase in graduation rates. There's an increase in learning outcomes from all the state level exams at every level, in both reading and math. So across the board, in terms of learning and sort of human capital accumulation outcomes, and for kids of different ages, we see that there are improvements and that they are very robust. So this is very good news. And it's also very good news that the FARC, the ceasefire created a surge in entrepreneurship, so the creation of new firms in former FARC areas. But if you look at this graph, it shows that this is only a very short-lasting thing that happened, and happened only in the first 2 years after the start of the ceasefire, so 2015, 2016. It reverted thereafter. It reverted starting in 2017. And why? It's because essentially investing in new firms is a thing that is very much aligned with expectations and uncertainty. And uncertainty increased a lot precisely because the victory of the no in the referendum, and thereafter the sort of empowerment of the right party that campaigned to tear apart the agreement, and the lack of implementation thereafter. So the sort of political dynamics that you did describe at the beginning, Erin, sort of map into what we find in terms of entrepreneurship after the peace agreement. You know, and this is forthcoming in the JD. So essentially, what I want to say is that there are positive results of the peace agreement, as probably expected, and I'm a big fan of the peace agreement. But of course, not everything is a silver lining, and the reason is that the peace agreement was not concomitant to efforts of the government to sort of bring institutional apparatus and the state apparatus to areas formerly affected by FARC, and it was not comprehensive enough, so that violence is persistent, not only because of dissidents of FARC, but also because of other armed groups that existed prior to the peace agreement, such as ELN and neo-paramilitary groups or bandas criminales. So this does point to actual policies in which you could actually take advantage of the new peace negotiations to try to sort of exacerbate the positive outcomes and minimize the negative outcomes. I'm happy to talk about those policies more in the Q&A. So I think this is it. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you for that presentation. I think truly a fantastic complement of approaches to thinking about negotiating with and ending irregular warfare, specifically in the case of the FARC. I particularly appreciated the very concrete and actionable recommendation of using whatever is to come to address the failures of the past or the shortcomings of the past. I think that's something that could really be taken up and put into practice. So thank you for that. And if I might humbly add as well, I think 2 days ago, we also reached the 381st assassination of Firmantes de la Paz. So the killing of social leaders has been quite worrying, and also the security conditions for the ex-combatants have also cast some doubt for them on the viability of their own processes. So So thank you both so very much. So we have a few minutes for questions. Yes, please, Sandra. Shall I?
No, super interesting discussion. So thank you for sharing all your learnings and experiences. I guess my question is more on your perspectives on the current Paz Total. I would love to hear what you think, whether it would be successful, or what is your take on this process?
Thank you, Sandra. Yeah, definitely. Um, One of the challenges for the current government facing Paz Total is there is a lot of groups to deal. You know, how to negotiate with the ELN. ELN, this is right now is the biggest organization in Colombia as a product of the lack of attention by the government within the negotiation with FARC. And the challenge at that moment was two tables, FARC and the ELN. And the ELN is a more well-structured organization than FARC, with more deepened roots within the population and a really tactical and operational and strategical level than FARC. But the other challenge is that one of the things to negotiate with the ELN is that is my perspective, is that they want just one negotiation, all the focus by the government with them. So spreading the negotiation with another pseudo organizations like FARC dissidents, Estado Mayor Central, First Front, with the AGZ, mainly based in the narco traffic, is challenging. At least you need one team per negotiation. One of the reflections that I have being part of the negotiation team is that I mean for between 2012 until 2016, that involved all the resources by the government, economical, international relations support, all the effort by the military also to support one negotiation. And right now, facing this diversity of negotiations is real challenging. The other thing is, what are their interests? What are the ELN? The ELN has a real will about the negotiation to get the peace, or is just an opportunity that they show us in the past with the other three negotiations? Their interest is a key factor. The other challenging thing is the link with the narco traffic and the illicit economies, illegal mining, the movement and the traffic of immigrants. Yeah, especially because these kind of illicit economies support and maintain the organization. So I think that is really ambitious and less pragmatical to this Paz Total to deal with a lot of different groups. So this is one of my perspectives.
Thank you. I agree. I agree with that. Essentially, so in addition to what Omar said, there are a few factors that I think are important. First, the sort of ELN as a witness of the failure of the implementation with the peace agreement with FARC clearly puts them in a position in which they will demand things that are different, right? So they are probably asking for for a different and hopefully more successful agreement, which is much more difficult to achieve. But Paz Total is not negotiation with the ELN. Paz Total is this idea, which of course conceptually, if you want, like as the legacy we want to leave to our kids, to our grandchildren, Paz Total is a great idea, but politically it's impossible to achieve. It's kind of crazy, and also under this leadership, which is also like very erratic and sort of so I guess if I was like in a policy making position, what I would try to do is try to make like peace negotiations with the lessons learned and all that with big groups such as the ELN, and then I think ultimately what's going to bring Paz Total, if anything, to Colombia is to have like a lot of local development and say capacity, period, right? With of course the monopoly of violence. So it's a long-term process that is not about self-negotiating with every single criminal organization out there, because that's impossible. I think we should collect like 3-4 questions and then we can hear it.
Juan, I was a little puzzled by the different findings on entrepreneurship and education. I kind of think of both entrepreneurship and education as intertemporal capital investments that both also require access to credit. I also think that education and entrepreneurship tend to be co-integrated, so that you find entrepreneurship, highly associated with high levels of education. So can you explain, unless there was a macro shock that intervened in that time series you have, how do you explain the differential findings?
Yeah, thank you for these very interesting insights and contributions. You mentioned that military intelligence is a very important part of successful negotiations, as the FARC example has shown. And I've kind of heard that there was a lack of this exact same strategy during the negotiations with the ELN. So like just a general lack of knowledge of what's going on in like the vast territorial expansions and presence of the ELN. So I was just wondering what has happened. Why is military, or why does military intelligence nowadays appear to be worse than it was during the rounds of negotiation with the FARC? Thank you.
Just building off of the last point you just made about the fact that you can't negotiate with every single criminal organization, but I was wondering, you do have limited resources, so how do you make the decision about which groups you bring to the table in a peace negotiation? Is it just strength, or like you said, there are some groups that are adapting or sending some kinds of signals? What do those signals look like? But just given the sheer number of groups and factions out there, how do you decide which are the cost-effective groups to bring to the table at what stage?
Thank you for the very interesting discussion. I had a curiosity about the unintended consequences. Is there any evidence on the impacts during the ceasefire or after that on the cultivation of illicit crops and the production of illicit drugs and narco trafficking in general?
So let me try to answer the questions addressed to me very quickly. So I will start in reverse order. So I had limited time, but what I've done these same presentations, sort of policy presentation in other audiences, and I do include a paper on that. And essentially, it's very much related to the sort of dynamics that we've been explaining in terms of what came out of the peace negotiations and the peace agreement, and sort of the incentives that created. Here I've highlighted incentives in the underlying structure of vacuum of power. Other armed groups are incentives to occupy those territories and all that. That has created these sort of unintended consequences to an extent. What has happened, according to my research, with the surge in illegal crops, has to do with that, in the sense that there was this announcement in May 2014. The government and FARC reached a partial agreement on illegal crops, and what they agreed upon back in 2014 was that they were going to create what is now the National Substitution of Illicit Crops Program, the acronym of which I'm not going to repeat. So they agreed upon that, and now what they did, so that was great. I think that like conceptually is good policy. The reason that was not in reality and it failed, and by and large, is that they actually announced publicly through a press release that they were going to do that, so that they ultimately, when the peace agreement was eventually going to be signed, they would create this program that was going to give material benefits to coca growers, right? So what we show is that essentially right after that announcement, coca started to grow in areas that were suitable to grow coca. So it has to do, it's in the list, sort of unintended consequences of the peace negotiation. So that's your question is on how to prioritize who to negotiate with is of course great, and it's very much political, and we could agree or disagree, and so it's part of our social welfare, social contract, what to do. What I would do is to try to negotiate first with the legitimate sort of political actors, such as CLN. You can dispute whether they are legitimate or not, whatever. I mean, they are political actors. And then, of course, if I had resources, I would prioritize criminal organizations that are very, widespread and very violent, and but definitely not. After that, not very much, in the sense that, as I said, ultimately, if you do that with every one single group, that's going to create, and without sort of resolving the development needs of vulnerable populations across the territory, plus the lack of state presence, that's going to sort of backfire, and it's going to create a lot more groups exposed, I think. And I think, I mean, so as I said, my interpretation of the dynamics of, there is this difference between sort of, there are two main conceptual mechanisms why conflict affects entrepreneurship. One is violence, right? And the other one is uncertainty. So uncertainty affects investors, but not necessarily uncertainty affects the decision of kids to go to school or parents to send their kids to school. You could disagree, but I wrote these two papers and published them well. So uncertainty, so macro uncertainty because of the political process regarding the referendum, etc. I think it's what sort of drives what we see with entrepreneurship. Any macro shock would probably have affected education as well, but it did not. So that's my answer to that.
Thank you, Juan. Yeah, okay. Really good. Yeah, about what is wrong right now. From my perspective, yeah, the military intelligence and the intelligence by the state is one of the key factors to support a negotiation. When you face a challenging organization like the ELN, really well specialized, and you don't have at least a really comprehensive understanding about their interest, their leaders, how they is their decision-making processes, how in the lowest level, the last combatant feel a negotiation. I think that you don't have the entire panorama that you need to face a negotiation. One of the things that I saw in the last 6 years, since the first sign of the agreement with FARC, was the decreasing about the capability in the intelligence. It was not just the military, Navy, but also the intelligence by the state. I think that we lost an opportunity because in the reincorporation process, it's really important to build, to shield, to protect the process of reincorporation. And you can do that with really good knowledge and information, with a lot of support to protect the people that is part of the reincorporation process, and definitely to attack factors like dissidents and other illicit economies that definitely affect the reincorporation process. So yeah, I saw right now there is not enough knowledge about the counterpart to maintain them in the table. Even I think is the opposite. The ELN maintain the government right now in the table with military pressure, with good capabilities in the territories. So yeah. But related with the signals by the groups, I think Sarman, with the ripeness, when he described the ripeness, the ripe moment for the groups to get on a negotiation is when both parties they feel that this mutual hurt stalemate. So the thing that we found in 2009 with this strategic link was precisely we identified the ripe moment for the FARC and for us. And I think that we are not in the right moment, in this ripeness moment with the other groups, because unfortunately the Colombian state is not really, I think, they don't do the task really strong to oblige these groups to stay in the table. That's why they are moving or they're pausing, they're dancing, yeah?
Bailamos entonces. In closing, I do want to thank our panelists for their insightful remarks and valuable perspectives on these critical issues, and also much gratitude to Princeton's Empirical Studies of Conflict for the invitation to moderate today and for hosting this panel as well. On behalf of the Irregular Warfare Initiative, I'd like to just say that we are proud to deliver relevant discussion to the IW community that is studying and adapting to an evolving security environment. So for those unfamiliar with IWI, the mission is to bridge the gap between scholars, practitioners, and policymakers through events such as this one, and also through our podcast, editorial content, and non-resident fellows program. So we're a team of over 50 volunteers from many different professional backgrounds who are passionate about the future of irregular warfare and putting research and solutions into the field. So if you haven't already, feel free to check out irregularwarfare.org, quick plug, and please sign up to receive our monthly email newsletter. On behalf of both ESOC and IWI, thank you all for attending this panel, and we look forward to hosting you at future events. This event has also been recorded and will post to ESOC and IWI's YouTube and social media channels. So good afternoon and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.